Hey, this is Chad Carter with ChadCarter.net, LearnHoloLens.com, and this week I'm going to bring a tutorial. It'll be actually a multi-part tutorial over the next few weeks, and it's going to be creating a ball that bounces. So I'm just creating a brand new project, and I'm going to call this bouncing ball toot. Alright, so Unity is what came up here after we created the project. Unity is obviously what I'm going to be using for this tutorial. This is just a default look of Unity. I'm not going to go into too much detail right now on the different windows in here, other than just say this is the scene window and the game window. This isn't necessarily the default. If you go over here to window and layouts, say default, this would probably be the default that you might be used to seeing. I personally like a little bit different layout, in which case I'll bring the hierarchy down here and split out the game over here. Right, so you kind of have a four window approach. And if I'm looking for the asset store, I'll bring that up. Otherwise, I'll just close out the asset store. And I have my console over here beside project if I need to see something for console. Unless I'm doing some kind of debugging, in which case I might bring it down here. So it'll be, but vast majority of the time, I'll have it right here beside project. And again, the project window is where we put all of our different assets for this project. So our scenes will go here, our scripts, materials, models, textures, whatever. Anything we're going to be using for our game, app, or even let's say HoloLens experience would be inside this project. And as we bring things in here, it actually copies them into a specific folder in Unity. So I'm actually coming here and say show and explore, and we'll see here that this is under my F Holo. Then we have this bouncing ball tutorial tutorial folder, and assets is under here. And so as I create different things, it'll create the items here under the assets folder. Alright, so to begin with, in the hierarchy, Unity defaults by adding a camera and directional light, and all those things are typically fine. We might even leave those alone for the minute, I'm not sure. But since this is ultimately going to be a HoloLens demo, what I want to do is actually bring in the HoloToolkit. So I've opened up a PowerShell window where so I brought up a PowerShell window, and I'm going to go into this HoloToolkit-Unity folder. I'm going to pull the latest here, which it's already up to date. I'm going to go ahead and open up the folder where this exists. Okay, I'll go ahead and close out my PowerShell. And again, that's just going to GitHub and grabbing the HoloToolkit. Inside of here in my HoloToolkit from GitHub, I'm going to go to the HoloToolkit and grab some of the actual project files you can use and drag those over here to assets. And it's going to be copying over the HoloToolkit into this Unity project. And this is how I start all of my Unity projects that will ultimately be running on the HoloLens. Alright, now that the HoloToolkit has loaded, I'm going to go ahead and just close out the folder here from where I had to get stuff from GitHub. I'm also just going to delete the main camera and directional light. There's really no reason to keep those since we're going to create a HoloLens deal. And I'm going to search for the word holo and drag over this HoloLens camera. So instead of using the default Unity camera, this is basically the default Unity camera with some values changed, like saying it's a solid color, change the background to black instead of being a skybox. it changes the clear or the clipping plane, the near value from a 0.3 to 0.85. That way, when you're getting really close to objects, it clips it more than it would if you're not using the HoloLens. And it's to make it a little bit easier on the user of the HoloLens. This manual gaze control script is something that's added into this prefab, and that is so that inside the editor here, we'll be able to use our mouse and keyboard to move the camera around, since the HoloLens itself is the camera. And obviously, if you deploy this to the HoloLens, then this code here in the manual gaze control isn't really going to be ran. It's only ran inside of the editor here. Okay. So that is the main thing that I want to pull in from the HoloToolkit. Technically, I could have just came in and used the Unity camera that was there, grabbed this manual gaze control script and brought that into my camera. I would not have this HoloToolkit menu item up here though, and so that's why I want to bring in the entire HoloToolkit, even though right this second all I'm using is the HoloLens camera. And again, later on we'll be using other stuff as well. So at the moment it may seem overkill to bring in, you know, all the information if all we're really using is the HoloLens camera, but we'll be using more later. Alright, next I'm going to actually create a ball. So I'm just going to come here to 3D object and say sphere. And again, I just did that by right clicking, saying create 3D object, and then selecting sphere. Okay, and I'm going to just call this, I'll call it bouncing ball. I want to add a different material to this ball, make it red or something. So I'm going to come in here to assets, create another folder, and call it materials. I don't have to do this. I could have just made it straight here in the root of assets. I want to try to keep things a little organized. And then once I'm in here, I want to say create new material, and I'll just call this the ball material. Inside the ball material, all I'm going to simply do is just change it to a red. So I'm not going to change anything else for here. And then I'm going to drag the material over here to the bouncing ball. And so now the ball material was using the default, or the ball was using the default material, now it's using the ball material. And we see it shows up as red. Now notice over here in the inspector window, again if you're not familiar with Unity, in the inspector window we have this notion of a transform. Okay? Every object inside of Unity has a transform, which has a position, a rotation, and scale. Notice the camera itself is at 0, 0, 0 in the world coordinates. So 0 on the X, 0 on the Y, and 0 on the Z. Y goes up and down, so notice over here in my scene window, okay, and X is left and right. And of course Z is forward and backward. Okay? And you'll notice when I bring it backward, it now sees the sphere, while originally the camera and the sphere, the bouncing ball, are in the exact location. So I could move the camera back, kind of like I was doing, right? Or I could move the ball forward, like hitting 4 or 5, and obviously I can scale the balls like 0.2, 0.2, and 0.2, for example. All right, so I can change the scale, I can change the position, and there's that. Now if I play this, nothing's going to happen. So the ball doesn't actually do anything, nothing happens. Now, because I am using the HoloLens camera, I can hold down my right mouse button in here and drag left and right to actually, move my camera around. And in fact, if I select the camera and then over here and start moving it, you can see the camera move over here in the scene view when I'm holding down my right mouse button and just kind of pivoting from left and right, and then kind of up and down. I can hold down my AS WD keys, like I'm holding S to back it up, W to go forward, right? So this would imitate me walking, if you will. So that's what this manual gaze control does inside this camera. Is it gives us the input that we have mouse and keyboard supported. We could hook up a Xbox controller or some other controller, check this box for joystick, and move around the scene with our joystick if we wanted to. Alright. So, do notice right there, something else that's kind of unique about Unity is when I hit play, I'm in play mode, and I came up here and I start looking at the sphere, and you kind of see that the camera up here is moving, right? As I'm going up and forth, the Z values change. I can kind of look to the right some, maybe hit the A key to start walking to the left some, right? So the actual value here for my position and rotation for my camera has changed. But I'm in play mode, so these are not going to stick around. As soon as I stop playing, watch the values over here, and they're going to reset to all zeros like they were before I started playing. And you see they're all zeros. Okay, so if you're in play mode and you want to tweak something, so let's say I'm in play mode, and this bouncing ball, I really want it further away from me, right? And I was like, something about right there, let's say. So that happens to be like 12.73. And if I want that very specific value, I would need to make a note of it. And because when I hit play, it's going to reset back to 5 like it was. In which case I need to come in here and say 12.73. And there's different ways you can do that. And in fact, I'm going to give you a little tip here. So assume that was 5, like it was. We come in here, we start moving this around to the way we want it, you know, so whatever it is, in this case, 12.74. I can, while I'm in play mode, come in here and click on this little gear and say copy component. Okay, and what that did is it copied these values into memory. Now I can hit stop here, or stop playing, and again, the ball reset to 5, but then I can click this gear again outside of play mode and say paste component values, and then it just pasted the values that was there. So if you're only worrying about one component, like the transform component, so the transform component is one thing, the sphere mesh is another, collider, mesh renderer, so all these things are their own components. And if you only have one component that you're really messing with in play mode and you want to, you know, push that back when you're done playing, then you can use that little trick of right clicking, saying copy component, and then outside of play mode saying paste component values, and that'll work. In this case, I'm going to reset that back to 5 because that's, I think, where I want it for now. Next thing we're going to do is actually create a 3D plane. So I'm going to come in here and say 3D object, and we're going to create a plane. We'll move this 5 on the Z, so it's a little bit further out, so it lines up, the center kind of lines up to where the ball is. My camera, instead of being right at 0, 0, 0, I'm going to actually modify the camera so more like at a person's head, so almost like, you know, 1.6 up there. I'll then change the bouncing ball so that it's high enough, so maybe like, well, 2.25 is fine. And the plane, I'm going to leave that at 0 because I'm basically saying in this scenario that my plane is the ground floor. Okay, so my plane is the ground floor, and my ball is over my head, but my head is, you know, 1.6 units high. All right, so maybe the height of a average person. Okay, so I'm going to hit play, and you'll see again, nothing happens. The ball just stays suspended in the air. I can move my camera around if I wanted to. Look down at the ground there, the plane. But that's where it stands. Okay, notice the bouncing ball has these different components I was talking about earlier. So again, almost every single game object, so each one of these, HoloLens camera, bouncing ball, plane, each one of those is a game object. And every game object has a component, is made up of one or more component, and just about every single game object at least has a transform component. But then this also has a mesh filter component of a sphere. This kind of gives it its shape, if you will. And then the mesh render is what it actually looks like. You know, is it casting shadows? Is it receiving shadows? So these are things that the Unity engine I can use for that. It has a material. What does it look like? And again, we actually created this ball material, made it red, and then I associated the ball material to the ball itself. Okay. Then we have a collider. And you can have different colliders, maybe a box collider or a sphere collider, and it's very much like the sphere, and it tries to so your sphere might have very fine details of, so if we take a look at the bouncing ball here, and so if we came in here and looked at the wireframe information, you can see all these different small triangles that make that up, right? But if you look at the collider doesn't have that much data around it. It's not, as you see, it only has a few wires, if you will, right? Because all it cares about is its radius and where that center is for the radius. If you have a complex mesh, maybe a model of, a spaceship or something of that nature, and maybe it has some wings and the body and whatever else. If you're trying to handle collisions on that thing, you would want to have multiple cube colliders and kind of draw the cubes out so it covered the big portions of that mesh, that complex mesh. There is such a thing as a mesh collider, in which case, if we had a mesh collider for this sphere, it would actually have triangles for every single triangle that's here. That's what the collider would be. And so any kind of physics calculations it would do it on every single triangle, which of course is a lot more expensive, takes a lot more computing power, uses more battery, than having much less data to check against. Okay? All right, so I'm going to take this back out of wireframe, bring it back up here to shade it. All right. Let's get back to looking something like that right there. All right, so let's talk about the different components. Right now, we want this ball to fall. And in order to do that, we want to go to the ball, we want to add in a new component. And this component is going to be a physics component, and we're going to add in a rigid body. And if by default, this use gravity is selected. If I take that off and hit play, we're not going to see much of a difference. I mean, there's no difference. If I check this box, then it'll fall. And of course, that's what we actually want to do for real, is add in the rigid body and let it use gravity. So when we play, it's going to fall down to the ground. And I can move my mouse down here and actually see, okay, yeah, it fell to the ground. The next thing I want to do is actually add in a physical material. Okay, so I added a physical material. So I'm going to go back over to materials and say create, and I'm going to create a physical material, and I'm going to just call it bouncy material. All right, and I'm going to say it has a bounciness of 0.8. And we're going to leave everything else alone for the moment. Now that's all I've done is what's my friction, how much bounciness do I have, how much does friction contribute, is average, minimum, multiplier, maximum. Same thing for the bounce combine. Okay. So I'm going to drag this bouncing material over into my bouncing ball. And so now my bouncy ball has this bouncy material inside the sphere collider. Now when we play this, you'll see the ball is going to fall and it will bounce. Dunk, dunk. Doesn't bounce very much, but it does bounce. And just let me get down here so you can kind of see a little bit better in the scene view. There it bounced. And if I move my mouse fast enough here to look down, you'll see it bouncing in the game view as well. So we can actually go and modify the bounciness to make it, say we want minimum friction and maximum bounciness. And we see it has quite a bit more bounciness there. It takes a little bit longer for it to come to a standstill. The last thing we're going to do in this video before we close it out is we're actually going to save this scene. So I'm going to go to Assets, create a new folder. I'm going to call it Scenes. And then inside here I'm going to say Save Scene. Go to my Scenes folder, and I'll just call it Main for here. And now we just have a Unity scene that we can pick up for the next part of the tutorial next week. So that's going to wrap up this week's tutorial. It's really just laying the foundation, laying the groundwork, if you will, for bringing this into HoloLens and actually adding in some more HoloLens specific items. But the main thing I want to point out is whether you're using the HoloLens or the Windows Holographic, API, and whether you're trying to do things specifically for that type of development or not, if you have any desire to learn Unity, it's relatively straightforward. There's lots of tutorials and videos out there. Again, over at devgame101.com, I have some tutorials on Unity. The material is all still very valid. I did it a couple years ago. But the only thing to be aware of, if you decide to go take a look at the videos over at devgame101, is when I talk about installing the tools. The tools you'd want to install as of now, January of 2017 here, is Unity 5.5 and Visual Studio, and whatever edition you want. So if you've not installed Visual Studio, then Visual Studio Community Edition 2015 is what I would use at this point. And of course, if you have Visual Studio Pro or Enterprise, that's totally fine as well. You can use the free version of Unity, or if you have the Pro version of Unity, that is of course okay. That's the version that I'm using, and it's all based off licensing agreements. As you need to read the end user license agreement and know whether or not you can legally use the community edition of Visual Studio and the personal edition of Unity. But if you're just getting started, then you can. So if you're just getting started, both companies, Microsoft and Unity, have made their tools free to get started. The emulator, if you're doing HoloLens development, you also want to make sure you grab the HoloLens emulator. And there is materials and documentation of exactly how to grab that and where that's at. But that is also free. It can become part of the Visual Studio community. So again, that's where we're going to leave the tutorial at this point. And next week we'll add the second part. I hope this has been beneficial. If you have any suggestions or questions, by all means, leave me a comment. I'll see you in next week's video.